In this lesson video, we will continue our discussion on pivot tables. Now we will focus on setting the fields, then the filter, and finally the slicer feature. Because in a previous lesson, we deleted all the existing pivot tables. Now we need to create a new pivot table from this main table. However, we will explore an alternative way to create a pivot table, and that is by using the recommended pivot tables button. When you click this button, Excel will offer you several pivot table models that you may be interested in using. Let's try to create this one. Basically, it divides the row by the citizenship category or field and divides the column by gender category. Click OK. And this is the result. We are now in a new worksheet. As you can see, unlike before, the pivot table has the fields already set by Excel. Until this point, inshallah, you have understood everything. Now, take a look at this rows box. Unlike before, now we have two categories or fields in this rows box. That is why we see these plus signs on the left side of the country names. If we click on its plus symbols, the names of students from that country will appear. Then to the right, the students' GPA scores will appear in a column according to their gender. This is because we have the gender field in the columns box and GPA in a values box. Next, notice that the value above is the sum of all the GPA scores below. This is due to the GPA field in the values box being set to sum. Generally, we don't need to calculate the total value of GPA scores. What we usually want to know is the average value of them. To change these values to average, you can click here and select Value Field Settings. Or you can also right-click directly on a cell and then select Value Field Settings. After the Value Field Settings window opens, change this option to Average. Now, before you click OK, you need to remember that the average value is a result of a division. Therefore, it will usually produce many numbers after the decimal. If you want to limit the digit after the decimal, you can click on the Number Format button. Choose the number category, then determine how many numbers you want after the decimal. Usually, GPA scores are displayed with just 2 digits after the decimal. So this 2 value is correct. Click OK, and click OK again. And this is the result. Instead of displaying the total number, these values now display the average value of the students from the current country. In fact, you can also see that these grand total columns and rows also display average values. So, it is more suitable if we change this header text to average so it is more relevant to the data type. Next, what if we don't want the names of students here? We only want to see the average GPA based on the country globally. For this, we have to remove the student name field from the rows box. There are several ways to remove a field. First, you can just drag the field out like this. So that is the first method. I undo this first. The second method is to press this little arrow button, then select Remove Field. Let me undo again. The last method is to disable the student name checkbox at the top. We discussed filters before. Basically, we use filters to hide or show data based on certain criteria. Now, in the pivot table, you can use filtering using two different features, namely the filter and the slicer. Both actually provide the same function. What's different is the location of the interface. The filter is attached to the grid, while the slicer hovers over the grid. Let's see an example of each of them. To use filters, let's say we want to use the residence category for the filtering. Just drag the residence field onto the filters box. And as you can see, the residence filter appears at the top. Let's try this filtering feature. Suppose we want to filter the data in this pivot table only to display students who live in dormitory building A. We can click here, choose Dorm A, then click OK. If you want to see only those who live in dormitory building B, click here again and select Dorm B, then click OK. We can also use several options in the filter. For example, we want to see the data of students who live in dormitory C and also dormitory D. You can click on this button again. Unlike before, first, you need to activate the Select Multiple Items checkbox. After that, you can now activate dorm C and dorm D at the same time. Click OK, and this is the result. Now, let's discuss slicer. In general, you don't need to use a filter and a slicer together at the same time. You only need to use one of them. But for now, just for demonstration, I will use both at the same time. To create a slicer, make sure the cell selection is inside the pivot table area. Then, in the pivot table Analyze menu, select Insert Slicer. Next, select the data category or field that you want to use. For now, we only want to use the same field as this filter, which is residence. Then click OK. And here is the slicer. Similar to graphic objects, you can move the slicer object to any position you like. You can also adjust the size if necessary. Slicers provide faster feedback when compared to filters. For example, we want to filter the data to only show private, dorm D, dorm C, and so on. We don't have to bother pressing the OK button to see the changes. And interestingly, the settings on the slicer automatically affect the settings on this filter. You can see how the filter reacts as we click on the slicer. Then, we can also activate the multiple items filtering by pressing this toggle button. When this button is active, we can activate dorm A and private, for example, at the same time. If you want to remove a filter, the process is similar to removing the other fields. You can just drag the residence field out like this from the filters box. And now the filter is gone. Then, to delete a slicer, you just need to select it first. Then press the delete key on the keyboard.